from Tweaktown. We'll be looking at the GTX 480, getting it prepped, modded and tested for sub-zero benching. In a couple of days time I'll be off to Japan to do some competitive benching of 3D Mark Vantage. But before I fly away I need to get 4 of these GTX 480s all insulated up, modded and tested to find the maximum frequencies, temperatures and voltages that each of the individual cards will respond to. So what we need to do is pull the card apart, get the mods done, get it insulated up and get it all tested. The first thing we need to do is pull this card apart. As you can see, I'm just undoing the screws now. Some of them are quite tight. I have to get under the warranty sticker. Obviously we'll be voiding any warranty that we do have with this card. And just in case you had illusions that you might have been able to get away with it, there's a foam strip here that we'll need to tuck in underneath to actually gain access to 2 of the screws. Just in here. And another one just in here. Get that insulation back. That out. We also have 2 screws just in this front plate. Now that we have 2 screws at the front and all our screws through the back plate, we'll now separate the card. As always with graphics cards, with the thermal compound and the pads that will be on the memory, you'll need to just gently wriggle it loose because it'll be quite tight. And eventually, screw here is attached. Put that off. I'll be able to separate it out. We'll have the fan header that will need to come off. Jiggle that free. We now have our heatsink and our main PCB separated. We'll go about cleaning up all this thermal compound. We'll remove these pads and we'll go on and start getting the modifications done. For one of my mods, I'm going to use a plug like you'd find on the end of the lead for the CPU fan inside your case. Using a plug like this means that when I grab a variable resistor, I can actually just plug the 3 little legs straight into the plug and it will make it easily removable so I can test with and without a mod, as you can see. Though only of course 2 of the wires will actually be active so that I can still use the variable resistor and change the voltages. For that I'm going to utilise your old IDE type leads. They've now got another use. we'll simply pull off a strand and we'll use that as our modding wire. It's nice and thin, and use the one with a copper core as it'll stick better when you solder it. We'll grab our little pins out of our case for our plug socket. I'll simply pop it into the clamp. I will add just a little bit of flux just inside, just to help the solder to flow slightly better as I pop the wire in. Grab our soldering iron, add a little bit of solder to it. Pop the wire in place. Simply solder that in. Now that we've got the wire and the little pin soldered together, we'll grab our plug and we'll slot it into place. Just use a small screwdriver to help push it in and lock it in. As you can see on the back, it's got a locking pin just in here. We'll add 2 more wires to that. I'll also put in the 3rd pin without a wire, just to help the variable resistor stick in. So when we plug it in, it's nice and tight, even with 1 wire. I like using this particular mod so that when I am trying to change voltages and different settings on any of my components, if I run into problems, I can simply unplug the variable resistor, as I said earlier, and then effectively makes the card stock again. And then while I'm sure that it is working, I can then just plug the variable resistor back in and attempt again at different settings. With some of the other mods, I already know that they're going to be permanent and required for everything that I'm going to be doing while benching, so I won't use the plug type arrangement and simply solder straight to the variable resistor itself. I'll grab my variable resistor, I'll pop it into the clamp, I'll grab another strand of wire from one of those old IDE leads, add a little bit of solder to the soldering iron, and solder the wire to the legs, like so. I'll then grab another piece of wire, so again add a little bit of solder to the soldering iron, and we'll again solder that piece on. And that will form the basis of our mod without using the plug type arrangement. Before I start to solder, I'm going to use the tip of a very sharp cutting blade to rough up the solder points on the board. Here you can see I just use the very tip of it, and I just simply scratch the top of the solder that's already on the PCB, just so when I actually solder to it, it will bond a lot easier. I'll just go through. These are the points that we'll be adding caps to. Through these points here. Just rough them up. I'll rough up a couple of these parts of the power connector pins. These bottom row are all earths, and I'll need a couple of those for when we add variable resistors, because we'll need to earth those, like so. Also got a point just in here, which is where we join up the memory mod. So just put a couple of scrapes on top of that. And here is where we're going to have a read point for the vGPU. If you can see, if it's still in shot, move this over. This is where the read point is for the memory. So I'll just scratch that up a little bit. And I'll carry on scratching the other points just so the solder sticks easier. Also, to help to make the soldering experience a little bit easier, after I've scratched up the points where I want to solder, particularly the cap points, I'm going to add a little bit of liquid flux, and from there we're going to add some solder to those roughed up parts and make a little ridge or a little mountain, if you will, so that when we come to actually join the caps onto the board, we'll have something to actually mould the solder to, instead of just trying to do it to a bare pad. So what we'll do is we'll grab our soldering iron, a little bit of solder, I'll heat that up, and we'll add some solder to those points, make a little ridge. A little bit more, we'll do the other one. And hopefully you'll be able to see that we have now two, if you will, little mountains or solder piles coming off the board, and these are very, very strong. So when I grab my caps, I'll be able to simply line them up later on and merge the two parts of the solder, one being this lot on the board itself, and I'll also put a little ball of solder on the legs of the caps, so I'll just simply bond the two together, and it'll be very, very quick to do. It should only take a few minutes to do all the solder points on this particular PCB. So it really comes down to prep work. If you do that correctly, everything else is a lot easier. Now that we've added solder to the mod points on the back of the graphics cards, we need to attach both the VR and the plug to the back of it. To do this, I'll add a little piece of 3M double-sided tape to the back of both parts. I'll remove the backing sheet and we'll add the first mod VR to the board. I'll just stick it down, and then we'll also add the socket plug like so. When it comes to solder some of these wires in place, my fingers are too fat and clumsy to be able to hold the wire on, so I'll use a little tweezers, and with the tweezers I'll hold the wire in place as I solder the point on, like so. With all the wires in place, it's now time to move on to the read point. Again, we'll use the 3M strips on the back of a Molinex connector, where we've placed two wires in as read points. One will be for the core and the other one the memory, and we'll simply place that near the top of the card, so that when we want to measure the voltages, the connector is at the top of the card, so we can place the probes near the top. And we have our VRs at the back, so when we have a 4-way SLI configuration, we can simply get to all the different VRs that we may need to at the back of the rig, so nothing's in our way. From here, we'll simply now solder on the read wires, the first one being the memory, which is just over here, and the second one being for the core, which is just in here. Now that we're ready to add the capacitors themselves, I'll simply hold it in place over those little mounds of solder that I added to the PCB earlier, and simply heat up the solder and mix the two together so I get a good coating, so they form a good seal. Obviously, as I showed you earlier, I've added solder to the PCB board itself, to the wee solder pads, as well as little mounds of solder to the legs on the actual capacitors. So when I come to do this part of it, everything's as prepped as possible. So I simply need to hold it in place and mix those two lots of solder together so I can form a good seal, or a good bond should I say, between the two. And we'll carry on that for the remaining 4 solder points. 5 capacitors down, 1 more to go. We'll place the last capacitor in place, mix the solder on the first leg, then the second leg, and we're done. All 6 capacitors firmly in place. Now that we've got all our mods done, we had the cold boot bug where we bridged these 2 points. We've got the memory mod going to an earth and to the point. We've got the plug, which can be optional for the GPU voltage with the point here and the ground point here. And then we're also using a Molinx 4-pin connector up the top here for read points. On this side we're going through to the GPU read, and on the right hand side we're going through to the memory read point. To help insulate around the GTX 480, we're going to use a gasket made from closed cell foam insulation. First of all, and just like I do with a CPU socket on a motherboard, I'll simply pop a piece of paper on it, push down around the core so it makes indentation lines, mark those lines out so I know where to cut, feel around the socket area for caps or any other things that might get in the way. We'll need to take some out for the connectors for SLI and any other obstacles we might have. Once we've done that, we'll then cut that out, which will give us a pattern just like this one here I've already prepared. As you can see, it slots on nicely. From there we'll take our pattern, which we can use repeatedly. We'll grab our closed cell foam insulation, pop that on, and from here we can simply mark out the area that we need to cut, which will end up looking like this. Now we can go around with the scissors and cut around the outside edge and use a sharp blade to cut out the center pieces, and we'll end up with a gasket like this one here, which when we place it on the unit fits snugly around the core. We've also used nail polish in and around these areas, and we'll also use some Vaseline as well, but as the gasket is closed cell foam insulation, that'll help to minimize any frost seeping through as well as any condensation build-up. As we come to heatsink the graphics cards, I'm going to use 4 different heatsinks on each card, though for this particular area here I'm going to have to modify the heatsinks. As you can see, this particular component right here sits higher than everything else that I want to cool. So if I was to place it on now, it would actually sit higher than the areas that are needed. So what I'm going to do is simply drill out a section in the heatsink, just in here. So when I place the heatsink on the component, that particular item is tucked away in that cavity. So when we have all the different parts lined up, it will look like this. For this section here, I'm going to use a copper heatsink that we'd normally see on the graphics card's memory, and that'll be placed right here. And that's how the heatsinks will look on this particular card. As we come to mount the graphics card onto the pot, what we're going to do is we're going to add some Vaseline to the graphics card. Just smear it on, again using our paintbrush. We'll go through and we'll get in between all the legs of the capacitors, just gently, and cover all the different components. We'll do the same on the front side of the card. So we have a good coating over all the different components to help stop any moisture related problems later on, particularly because the rig that we're testing for today will have 7 different liquid nitrogen pots on it, so condensation is going to be a major issue for us. So I've gone through and gone a little bit overboard with the card preparation, using nail polish as a first barrier over the card, then also using Vaseline as yet another layer, and then we're going to use close foam insulation as yet a third barrier to try to minimise the effects of the condensation on our card. Now that we've got a good clean coating of Vaseline, we're going to pop on our closed cell foam insulation. For testing, I'm using a Kingpin Cooling Tech 9 3.0 GPU pot. When we actually come to do the proper benching, and when we've got the 4 cards, we'll actually use Tech 5s, which are thinner, but for this demonstration, or this preparation should I say, we're going to use this particular pot because it's easier for me to use. But what I am going to have to do is pop on this extra piece of foam onto the pot, simply because this pot has a higher recess on its front plate. So the foam that I've made here for this card is actually designed for the Tech 5. Because I'm using Tech 3 for this part of the testing, I'll just pop an extra piece on just to help cover it off. Squeeze a little bit of thermal compound onto the GPU. And mount this on. Just like so. I've already done a test mount to make sure that all my foam insulation is the right size, so I get a good even spread on the core and the pot, to make sure that we have a nice transfer of cooling. Tighten these nuts up. There we have it. We'll have a nice good seal around here. Off camera, I'll go through now and a bit more foam, a bit more Vaseline around all the different components. I'll also finish off Vaseline in the back of the card, and then we're ready to mount it. In and around the PCIe slot, I'm going to use Vaseline as a barrier to stop any moisture causing any issues with the circuits. For this, I'm simply going to use a paintbrush and my Vaseline and simply coat on in between the slots, around any of the components. as well as a little bit in the socket itself, just to stop any moisture getting in. I'll also put some on this second slot down, as the pot itself will be sitting on that, so there will be a condensation and frost issue at the bottom of that. And we'll just coat in around the components. Again, using this paintbrush means that I can get in to all the tight little areas in between caps, right in underneath the actual socket itself, and around the sinks, so we won't have any issue with moisture. With the Vaseline in and around the socket, we'll now pack the other areas with paper towels, so that if we get any moisture build-up, these will soak that up. It's just another form of defence to make sure that we don't run into any condensation related issues. So simply carry on the different sockets, layering it up so that we can get a nice and even coverage, so that when we put the graphics card in and the pot sitting down, it'll keep it still nice and straight. Once we've packed in all around these areas, we'll then also lay some paper towels flat over top, like that, that the actual CPU pot will be sitting on. And this again is to help to reduce any issues that you might get with ice build up at the bottom of the pot and its insulation seeping into the other sockets. Vaseline all in place now, it's time to get this pot mounted. So with all our paper towels all stacked in, and all we stack here that the bottom of the pot will actually be sitting on, we'll simply slide it into place. Like so. And from here we'll just pack more paper towels in and around the back of it and just into these bottom corners. We'll also mount a fan to blow over the heat sinks that we installed. Something like 100 plus CFM should do the trick, and then we're ready to start testing the card. To test these GTX 480s, we'll use a Gigabyte X58A UD9 motherboard, a Intel 980X CPU, Corsair Dominator GT memory, and a Antec TPQ 1200 OC Edition power supply. As we saw earlier when we were mounting the pot, we're using a Kingpin Cooling Tech9 3.0 GPU unit, and for the CPU we're using air cooling. We'll get this started up and we'll get into testing. Just like we do for a CPU, if we need to warm up the GPU pot because of a cold boot bug issue, or I simply need to warm the temperature up for whatever other reason, again we'll use a propane torch like this one and warm it up. This is also handy when I'm trying to dry out the pot to do a quick change as I'm testing other cards. For testing, I'm keeping the CPU at 4.2 GHz. At the moment, I'm just doing a straightforward run at approximately 1050 on the core. I'm going to keep this the GPU at approximately minus 100, minus 110, and the voltage is at 1.22. I'm just having a quick look to see how the voltages and temperatures perform, to see if I've got any cold slowdown issues as I creep my way up the different speeds, voltages and temperature ranges. I'll need to do this on all four cards, so when we run them in 4-way SLI, we know exactly what each card will do because we'll need to run them at the worst performing card speed. Otherwise, we'll have crashes and lockups, and with 7 pots running, it'll be too complicated to problem solve with that many things going on. So here I can simply isolate one card at a time because I know the rest of the system is stable, and find the maximum settings that each of the cards will do.